We just had one of our first Silver Age tournaments with a pretty strong turnout. About 150 players. This happened in Japan, and I wanted to go through the meta evaluation and basically helping you think about 5 picks that you could bring to any of these upcoming Battle Hardens, whether that's Valencia, Seattle, Hong Kong. The representation is about what we expect. Ton of Ira, Guardians, aggro decks, specifically, Briar, Fi, Azalea, although I think Azalea's representation was a little bit lower than I expected. But the interesting thing here is Chane being pretty low in copies, but had an incredible top 8 conversion, putting 5 copies in the top 8. From my understanding, and this could be incorrect, so if this is misinformed, someone please let me know. But it seemed like this was a group of players who all took almost a near identical list. I heard that there was some discrepancy between some of the blue counts, but overall this was a list that was brought as a meta call to the event to specifically be Ira and the Guardians. And I think this is pretty interesting because I'm seeing a lot of people have kind of a knee-jerk reaction to seeing 5 of the same hero in top 8 and immediately assuming that the deck is broken. That it's ban worthy in terms of the community vote, all that kind of stuff. And it could be true, but I feel like I need to point out some things about tournament results that sometimes you need to account for, how decks ended up in top 8. So it could be that this deck is insane. Chane has a very broken hero text, basically letting you draw cards and get go again. However, if these players specifically brought this as a meta call, I think this would make a lot of sense because if you can find a deck that can angle the meta, whether that's targeting, Ira and Guardian in this instance. And if you hit them in Swiss, then your deck does what it's supposed to do, and then you launch yourself into top 8, which is a fantastic meta call payoff, right? This deck was paired into, Azalea and Briar all day. Maybe it doesn't have the same tournament result. And you have to consider other decks that maybe were on the bubble. So for instance, I heard that Shoma was X and 2 and bubbled out of top 8, and he was on Ira, right? So if Ira had, put itself in the top 8 just on a breaker, then people might feel differently. And so just looking at the top 8 by itself, at the end of the day, 5 heroes in top 8, you got to consider it, right? So it's on the list for today, but I do think it's worth always kind of taking top 8 with a grain of salt because there's a lot of other factors that go into it. A simple breaker can completely change how people perceive the meta, but this is my interpretation of the list. I think the only difference was I think some of the lists were on Blood Tribute. I wanted to convert my previous list to be as close to it as possible. There's, I think, a couple different cards, almost like a Vincent deck at this point. In my opinion, when I first, talked about Silver Age, I figured that Vincent would be the better RuneGate deck because cards like Dirge, are not legal. And so I just felt like her having the passive rune chant generation every turn and also having Whale would probably make her a little bit more consistent. But I, definitely see the merit that, Chane's ability, just basically letting you draw cards is kind of insane. If Chane is the better RuneGate deck, totally fine with being wrong on that. This hero has been broken in every single format. But the only difference here is there's a lot more rune chant generators. So you have cards like, like Reed, like we had before, but this is definitely leaning a lot more into trying to actually stack rune gates. So you have full rainbow Spellblade Assault, you have the incants now, you have Reduce. So you can kind of play like normal RuneGate tempo into the aggro decks and then into the slower decks. So I guess this was happening into Ira and the Guardians. So you can just kind of stack and play like almost OTK where you can at least set up a pitch stack, some rune chants available, and then you can like triple RuneGate on the final turn basically after playing just some normal early game turns. Down in the sideboard we have an Arcane Cussing, which I believe you would play if you're going to stack, right? Because you can have Bodice and then you can just have it sit on the field for the final turn, pop it, and then go the 3 rune chants. So you can just have your triple RuneGate really easily. And adding Pummel, I think, is pretty good against aggro. It wasn't a card I was on before. And, Sigil and Time Step are all stuff you've seen before. But overall, time will tell if this deck has the power to stick in the format. It's very possible that this was just a regional call that paid off really well. But I want to give it a fair shout out because, 5 copies in top 8 is crazy. So we'll have to see if this is like actually like a beast of the format or if it was just Dark Horse that had a good run. But originally for my 5 heroes today, I was going to have KO in here, but KO hasn't been performing well. And then after kind of reflecting on some more, Fab Blazing data, I just don't really think he has like game into the top represented heroes. I think that he beats up a lot of things that aren't doing insanely broken things. But when you look at what the most represented decks were at this tournament, he doesn't really consistently beat any of them. I think he was unfavored in almost all of them. So I gave the edge to Chane, right? That all makes sense. Next up, we got the most represented deck. This is Ira. This is my version of it. Obviously, we don't have all of the tournament, deck lists out there, but a lot of these decks are kind of homogenizing. So I feel pretty confident that most Iras are going to be playing a shell pretty similar to this. We have our Tiger equipments. These are just the best thing that you can be doing. I think it's why she's actually so strong because you can just block 4 with your fridge, which is pretty good in this format. It means you can stop things like, Boulder Drop without giving a single card. And then you can convert all these back for not only 2 damage, but you can also get a resource, which is pretty huge. And the deck list itself is trying to be very aggressive, but you do have a lot of block 3s in this deck, so you can pivot to a more mid-range game plan. Like you can just block with 2 cards and go like, Kodachi Sirens is a 2-card 8, but then also gaining the life at the end. Or you can do something like Kodachi push the point, or Kodachi push the point if you don't want to take the gamble. And then what's kind of important here is that we have a lot of 1 cost with Go Again. Now this is going to be relevant when we talk about Oldhim and Guardian in general. Some of the Guardians are teching this in the matchup now, because if they block with it, they can give you a Vigor token. It'll pop on your turn and you have a resource floating, so you can't actually get a blue in your pitch to give your Kodachis Go Again. What we're doing here is we're adding a lot more 1 cost, so that way if they ever do that, you can actually just get a net benefit and just be able to play something with the resource, and then you can pitch your blue and use your Kodachis. So you don't want to get blown out to this. So I think it's kind of important that we include more 1 costs here. But overall, the deck is exactly like what it was before. It's just playing like the best numbers in the format. It's just, go wide. Your sideboard includes some anti-arcane stuff, unmovables against the tall decks like Azalea and Guardian. You have Waxon, which can also be played against Azalea, but also really good against things like Briar. You have cut down the size against the aggro decks. Next up, we have Briar, which I still feel like is an incredibly powerful deck in the format, but it could be that decks like the Guardians are just gatekeeping her a little too hard. I mean, she does fall apart pretty hard at Disruption, but we've amended the list a little bit to be a little bit more aggressively proactive. So before we had a little bit more equipment, but now we're leaning into cards like Bracers of Belief, just because we're on that red line build, so we should just be pressuring damage. But overall, the list hasn't changed. You're playing a fully red line deck, Cheerios build. Your goal is to try to generate, embodiments by going, double non-attack in a turn. So you go like Burn Up Shock, play Nimbleism, and then you can play like a Snatch for 7 with Go Again with the Burn Up active. And then we added the Electrostatic Discharge and the Fries just to have a little bit more lightning density, but also just because these are just efficient 0 for 3 head jabs basically. So before you're playing like some kind of inefficient like non-attacks that weren't converting to 3 true value. So we've just really min-maxed everything in the deck now at this point. Our sideboard is kind of questionable. We have some Spellfray, Arcane, Polarity. These all make sense. Sigil's fantastic in this deck, but I'm still trying the 2 evergreens with the 2 blues just against Guardian, because they will just play fatigue into you. If they're not going to like really try to race damage, they'll probably just try to full block you out. So I am still trying this just because I also can't think of a better thing to include in the deck. Like everything here is like the most efficient card I could possibly find in the card pool because it plays all reds. But if there is like a specific tech piece that you want for these 4 slots, I say go ahead on it, because I'm not entirely sold that the evergreen package is what actually solves your Guardian matchup. And then we're on Reaping Blade. I've gone back and forth between this and Starfall. At the end of the day, I think that maybe sending 3 when you have Burn Up and Shock is a little bit too important. The Blade Beckoners just cover the Starfall a little bit too easily, and most of your cards have Go Again. You don't have that many Chain Enders outside of like Snatch, which you can give Go Again regardless, and Arcanic Shockwave. I don't think you're really fighting over, converting Go Again on the weapon in the middle of the turn, so I think this is kind of okay just as a Chain Ender. So that was like the only thing that I think is worth playing around with. Azalea has been a little bit interesting because it hasn't been as explosive as I thought it would be. I do think that the deck has a little bit of variance issues. Some of it comes down to the fact your equipments do not block at all. So if you can't like draw really hot hands in the openers, then sometimes your opponent just gets that extra couple life off their equipment and they just kind of beat you on that small margin. The deck hasn't really changed at all. I don't think we've made any changes since we covered it previously. It's just plain Death Dealer. So you're just loading an arrow, playing as many pumps, abusing the fact that Death Dealer just draws you a card. We added Talismanic Lens because the Honing Hood got banned. This card's really powerful because if you just pick first every time in this deck and you get to opt, let's say like a non-attack to the top, so you draw it with your Death Dealer draw, and then the next card you make an arrow, and then you dominate the arrow. Like if you just dominate on turn 0, I think you just win every single time with this deck. So this deck is very variance heavy, which I think is probably why it's not, converting into top 8 yet, but we'll have to see, right? This is just one event. It could very well top 8 the Battle Hardens at the next 3 events. So you never know. Like it's not a solid format yet. So we'll have to see, but I kind of could understand why maybe some people are hopping off the deck. It has some variance issues, but when it does work, it's like the most broken thing in the format, basically, outside of Briar. And then finally, we have the Guardians. There are a few that I think are playable. So for instance, Valda made top 8. So I guess you can make an argument for her. And I do think that Terra has some meta angle where you can play it because it has a slightly favored matchup into Oldhim, but it does suffer in the Briar and Ira department, which I think is why I would always prefer Oldhim as my default. You have the widest card pool available, and Ice React on this hero is just fundamentally so broken, and then Earth React is what actually allows you to beat decks like Ira. The other Guardians just can't deal with the fact that proactively in the endgame, she's always just stripping 2 cards with a blue. And so the fact that Oldhim actually gets to cover those with the Earth React really efficiently, I think just helps him get the extra mile in the matchup to actually like run her out of cards. And while Shaman was very heavily represented, we don't know where they ended up at, but they did not end up in top 8. Needless to say, there's a lot of different Guardians you can play. I'll go ahead and link a bunch of my different Guardian lists, but I'm just going to showcase Oldhim for the sake of time today. So Oldhim, we are adapting a little bit. So we have the Civic Duty against Ira, and then we've added some more of the block 4s. So we just need better numbers in this deck to compete with a lot of what's happening in the format. And so we've gone from 4 to 6 here. And so we've cut the Clash of Might and we've just added these Clash of Arms and Heads because increasing the density means that we're higher likelihood to lose with the Might one. So Crash and Bash is just staying here. It's fantastic. Other than that, the deck has mainly remained the same. We've just added blue Sirens over one of the blue ice cards, mainly just because this gets you that kind of edge in the Ira matchup, being able to block a Kodachi for 2 and then still like carrying over 1 life. I think it's kind of important. It basically becomes a block 3 over the first 2 links in a certain sense. So I've noticed that this card actually helps the margins with that matchup a lot. It'll also go the mile into things like Chane and stuff like that. And you still want to play the 10 attacks. I think these are still really important. I've seen some people trying out the heave ones, the anti-guardian stuff for the mirror. I think that without Blossom though, I don't want to heave 2, I want to heave 3. So I'm still including Red Thunderquake, and then Red Glacial is just insane. I think that you can actually beat Chane pretty reliably, but we'll have to, test more and then see what's happening with that matchup. I think having the proactive damage is important against Chane because you need to actually pressure cards from their hand when they're trying to get into their pitch stack. So you need to actually rip things from them rather than just letting them keep their like final 4 card grip with their final Soul Shackles. And then our sideboard now, we're including Renounced Grandeur. This is good against Chane. Specifically, it's also very good against Briar, and it's also good against Azalea. Into Azalea, they can't make their, disease tokens. Into Briar, they can't make embodiments, and into Chane, they can't make Soul Shackles or Rune Chants. So this is all really important stuff to be having. So I've included this over the place of like Crush the Week, just because Fi completely disappeared out of the format basically. But everything else here is the same, unmovable. We're just greeting more in all these lists and only including AB1 until like Icelander and Verdance go way higher representation along with Kano. I don't think we need to be playing Arcane Barrier 3, but we do have 1 copy of Arcane Polarity if you want to fatigue Briar or just have a little bit of edge against the Arcane heroes. So overall, those were the 5 decks that I think you might want to consider. There are other things as well. So once again, I feel like these will be the decks that are very highly represented at the tournaments. And then much like what happened with Chane, if you have a deck that you think will target the meta between all these different heroes that you're expecting to play against, then you can totally have a shot at top 8, right? So very similar to what happened previously where everyone was expecting, Ira and Guardian. You can make a similar read and do something with that information. But these were the 5 decks that I feel like have been, proving themselves. These 4 specifically have, been tested very extensively and have been very powerful. So, Ira, Briar, Azalea, and then Oldhim specifically, but also kind of the Guardians as a whole. But the one thing that's kind of been a breakout has been Chane. So I wanted to throw it on the list for this week. And if you're going to any of these upcoming Battle Hardens, I hope it's helpful. I'm just getting you prepped and testing for the event. But until next time, thank you for watching.